The morning Josephine Hartwell stood in the Hartwell drawing room and heard a footman speak a name she did not recognize, and did recognize, all at once. The fire had been laid fresh, and the room smelled of beeswax and October. Her mother sat in the high-backed chair near the window, the one she reserved for formal occasions, and her hands were folded in her lap in that particular way that meant she believed the morning was entirely under her command. 6 women sat arranged across the settees and side chairs, the daughters of the neighbourhood's better families, there for what Lady Hartwell had privately described to her housekeeper as a civilized resolution. Sir Reginald Forsyth stood near the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the marble as though the room were already his. Josephine stood at the threshold of the room she had grown up in, wearing a grey wool dress she had pressed herself that morning, and she felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes, and did not look away from the door because the footman was still speaking. He said the name a second time clearly, the way footmen are trained to say names when the announcement matters. Lord Ellsworth Crane of Ashford Park. And, before another breath passed in that room, Josephine understood everything that had seemed without explanation for the previous 3 weeks, and she felt something she could not have named if she had tried, something very close to the sensation of a window being opened in a house that had been shut up all winter. She had not known, and she had answered his question anyway. 3 weeks before that morning, Josephine had been sitting at the writing desk in the smaller of the 2 upstairs rooms when her mother opened the door without knocking. This was not unusual. Lady Hartwell had not knocked on any door in Hartwell House for as long as Josephine could remember, a habit she'd developed when her husband was alive and had never relinquished since his death 4 years prior. She entered rooms as a general enters a field, scanning for the position of troops before the greeting. Josephine set down her pen. She had been answering correspondence on her mother's behalf, a task that had fallen to her steadily since the previous spring, when Lady Hartwell's eyes had begun to trouble her in dim light. The letters were from dressmakers, from a cousin in Bath, from the curate about the arrangement of Sunday flowers. Nothing that required Josephine's particular voice, only her particular hand. Her mother sat in the chair across the writing desk, without being invited, which was also not unusual, and said without preamble that arrangements had been made with Sir Reginald Forsyth, who had been a widower for 2 years, and whose estate at Crest Hollow was 7 miles east and in better repair than appearances at the Michaelmas Fair might suggest. Josephine did not immediately speak. She had learned in the years since her father's death had left her mother the sole engine of the household's future that the first sentence in these conversations was never the whole sentence. She waited. Lady Hartwell said that Sir Reginald was expected to call on Thursday, that he understood the general outline of the arrangement, and that it would be a relief to everyone concerned to see the matter settled before the winter made travel inconvenient. Josephine asked very quietly whether Sir Reginald had asked for her opinion. Her mother said that Sir Reginald had spoken to her directly, as was proper, and that she had spoken on Josephine's behalf, as was also proper, and that a girl of 23 with no fortune of her own and a modest portion that could not survive a 3rd season in London ought to consider the matter already half decided by circumstance rather than choice. The afternoon light was going. Josephine could hear the housekeeper, Mrs. Fogel, moving on the landing outside, the soft sound of linen being carried from one room to another. She picked up her pen and set it down again without writing anything. She said, with the particular evenness she had been refining since she was 17, that she would be ready to receive Sir Reginald on Thursday. Her mother's expression did not change, but her hands, still folded in her lap, relaxed very slightly, the way hands relax when a contract is felt to have been signed. Josephine did not tell her mother what she was actually thinking. She very rarely did. Thursday came, and Sir Reginald Forsyth arrived in a carriage that was newer than his position quite warranted, accompanied by a man of business named Mr. Aldous Cray, who waited in the hallway while Sir Reginald was shown into the drawing-room. Josephine sat across from him for 40 minutes and learned that he was 51 years old, that his previous wife had left him no children, a circumstance he described as unfortunate without any evident grief, that he kept a good table, and that he believed a woman's first obligation in a second household was to not make herself felt in the arrangements already established. He did not once ask Josephine a question. He addressed his remarks primarily to Lady Hartwell, though he occasionally included Josephine in the general direction of his gaze, the way one might include a door in a survey of a room. After he left, Lady Hartwell said he had been very agreeable. Josephine agreed that he had been agreeable and went upstairs to change for the evening. 3 days later was the Ashford Assembly Rooms Ball, held on the 3rd Thursday of October, as it had been held every year for as long as Josephine could remember. Lady Hartwell had attended every year until her knee began to trouble her, and she had sent Josephine every year since, accompanied by Mrs. Fogle's daughter Agnes, who was 28 and had the general goodwill of the neighbourhood, and a husband who worked in the next village and could not attend balls. Agnes was a comfortable companion. She did not ask questions during dances, and she liked to stand near the punch table, which freed Josephine from the obligation of standing near the punch table herself. The rooms at Ashford were not large, but they were well lit, with candles set along the upper rail and a fire at each end of the main hall. And in October, the warmth was welcome enough that the assembly always drew nearly 40 people from the surrounding parishes. Josephine wore the pale blue dress that she had worn to the previous 3 assemblies, with the white gloves that had been her mother's, and a small comb in her hair that had been her grandmother's. She looked, she knew, respectable and unremarkable, which was generally the safest thing to be in a room like this. She danced the first 2 sets with Mr. Palmer's eldest son, who was pleasant and had nothing particular to say, and was resting near the south wall between sets when the man who had given his name simply as Mr. Edward Crane asked her if she would stand up with him for the next country dance. She noticed, as she took her place across from him in the set, that his coat was well made, but not new. His hands, when he took hers at the turn, were clean and steady. He was perhaps 10 years her senior, with the kind of face that did not announce itself but held attention once found, and he moved through the figures of the dance without any of the self-consciousness she had observed in younger men performing for a room. They came together at the bottom of the set, and he asked her, without any preliminary and with a directness she was not expecting, whether she had read the verses in the December issue of the Literary Gazette, the ones the editors had declined to attribute. She said, without thinking, that she had, and that she had thought them very poor, and that the lack of attribution was a mercy to whoever had written them. He looked at her for a moment. She became aware, immediately after speaking, that she had been rather more direct than was strictly required by the acquaintance of one dance, and that she did not know this man well enough to know whether he found directness offensive or merely odd. He said, with something in his tone that was not quite amusement but was in the general vicinity of it, that he was glad she had said so. The set ended. He thanked her and did not immediately withdraw, which was unusual, but then Mrs. Alderton of the next parish came forward to speak to him by name, though she called him Mr. Crane and nothing else, and Josephine moved away to find Agnes near the punch table and did not think particularly hard about the exchange, because it had been simply an exchange, and she had other matters to think about. What she did not know, and would not know for 3 more weeks, was that he had been thinking about precisely one thing from the moment she had finished speaking. She encountered him again 5 days later, on the lane that ran between Hartwell House and the village bookshop. Josephine walked to the bookshop twice each week on fine days, half a mile each way, a habit her father had established when she was a girl, and that her mother tolerated as a mild eccentricity rather than a genuine concern. She was returning from the shop with a slim volume under her arm, one of Mrs. Radcliffe's earlier novels that she had not yet read, when she saw him standing outside the shop door with an elderly woman who was sitting on the stone step, looking pale and tired. The rain had started in the last quarter hour, a fine, persistent October rain that was not quite cold enough to be serious, but was steady enough to matter. The elderly woman, who wore a dark coat that was beginning to darken further at the shoulders, had apparently come out of the shop and sat down because walking any further had seemed inadvisable. Mr. Crane was standing over her with a look of mild helplessness, his own coat collar turned up, glancing down the lane as though waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Josephine did not particularly consider what to do next. She unwound the shawl from her shoulders, the cream wool one with the blue border that she had made herself in the winter of the previous year, and she offered it to the elderly woman, who turned out to be called Mrs. Hewitt, who had come into the village from a farm 2 miles east to see her granddaughter, and had not expected rain. She helped Mrs. Hewitt arrange the shawl around her shoulders, and told Mr. Crane that Mrs. Fogel kept a dry room at the back of the bookshop that the owner allowed for exactly this kind of weather, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. And between the two of them, they settled Mrs. Hewitt inside with a cup of tea and the bookseller's one-legged stool and a window that faced the lane so she could watch for her granddaughter. Mr. Crane said when they came back to the doorway that she had managed the whole thing with what he could only describe as intelligence. Josephine said that it had only required looking at what was in front of her. He agreed that most people found that the hardest part. She was about to reply when she noticed that he was standing at an angle to the lane, his shoulders slightly squared, that particular quality of stillness in him that she had noticed at the ball and had not been able to account for. He was watching the lane, ostensibly waiting with her for the granddaughter. But there was something in his attention that felt less like waiting and more like observing, and she could not have said precisely what the difference was. The granddaughter arrived in less than 10 minutes, a girl of about 15 in a damp bonnet, and Mrs. Hewitt was collected and the shawl was transferred to the granddaughter's shoulders, since Mrs. Hewitt declared herself warmer than she'd been in half an hour, and they departed down the lane toward the farm. Mr. Crane said he would see that the shawl was returned. Josephine said there was no urgency and walked home in the rain without it, and found, somewhat to her own irritation, that she thought about the conversation for the rest of the afternoon without being able to identify exactly which part of it she kept returning to. The weeks following contained 2 more encounters inside the assembly rooms, one at a musicale at the Alderton House, and one accidental and brief near the old library anteroom at the rooms themselves, where a second small gathering had been arranged, and where she found herself, through no particular design, in conversation with him for nearly half an hour before Agnes appeared at her elbow, and reminded her that they were expected to take tea with Mrs. Palmer before the second set of music began. Each conversation had the quality of the previous ones. He asked questions that were direct and slightly unexpected. She answered without calculation, a habit she had developed not out of courage, but out of a simple preference for the economy of honest speech inside a world that generally required its women to speak only in careful, managed sentences. He listened in a way she had not encountered often, without already composing his reply while she was still forming hers. She did not know what to make of him. She did not try particularly hard. What she understood clearly, and could not avoid understanding, was that the arrangements with Sir Reginald Forsyth were progressing on a schedule that did not require her participation. Mr. Cray, the man of business, had called at Hartwell House twice more and had been admitted to the morning room both times. Josephine had not been present at either meeting. She had been told briefly by her mother that the settlements were in hand. It was the second of these meetings that undid something. Josephine had come downstairs from the library on the upper landing, carrying a tray of letters she had finished answering, intending to leave them on the hall table for the morning post. The morning room door was not fully closed. It had been left 3 or 4 inches ajar, the way doors are sometimes left when the people inside them believe that no one is in the corridor. And Josephine heard her mother's voice before she had crossed the landing threshold, and was therefore not able to walk away without it being too late. Her mother was speaking to Mr. Cray in the comfortable, slightly expansive tone she reserved for men of business who needed to be managed rather than impressed. She was describing in broad and confident terms the nature of her daughter's character. Josephine stood in the corridor with the letters in her hands and listened. Her mother said that Josephine was agreeably biddable. She said this without hesitation or qualification, the way one states a well-established fact. She said that she had given Josephine every advantage of education and society, and that the girl had the sense, at least, to understand the limits of her own situation, and would not cause Sir Reginald any of the difficulty that a more willful temperament might produce. She said that Sir Reginald would find, once the arrangements were finalized, that he had acquired something undemanding and serviceable, and that she herself was confident there would be no objection from that quarter that she could not manage. Mr. Cray said something in a lower register that Josephine could not make out. Lady Hartwell laughed very slightly, the small social laugh of someone graciously agreeing, and said that yes, one might say she had been well prepared for the arrangement, and that a daughter in Josephine's position did not, really, have the luxury of anything else. The morning post tray was cold in Josephine's hands. The corridor smelled of floor polish and, faintly, of the lavender her mother had grown in the garden and dried every August for as long as Josephine could remember. She walked the rest of the way to the hall table and set the letters down and went back up the stairs with the empty tray, and sat in the library at the upper landing for a very long time without reading anything, looking at the wall above the fireplace where her father's portrait had hung until her mother had had it moved to the small room off the kitchen that no one used. She was not, she told herself, surprised. She had known what her mother thought of her. She had known it in the way one knows the temperature of a room one has lived in for years, not with shock, but with a settled, permanent knowledge that exists below the level of active thought. What had changed was that she had heard the words used to describe her in a transaction in which she was the item under discussion, and had therefore lost the ordinary comfort of the knowledge remaining theoretical. Agreeably biddable. She sat with it for a long time. On the 4th day following the corridor, Josephine went to the writing desk in the upper room and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Sir Reginald Forsyth, brief and formal and unambiguous, stating that she understood an arrangement had been discussed on her behalf, and that she must inform him, with courtesy, that she was not able to enter into the proposed settlement, and that she regretted any inconvenience this caused to his own plans. She signed it with her full name and sealed it, with plain wax, no crest. The second letter was to her mother, 3 sentences, laying out the same information in the plain language she would have preferred to have used in the corridor if she had been inside the morning room rather than outside it. She put on her walking coat, took both letters downstairs, handed the one addressed to Sir Reginald to the housekeeper's boy with instructions for immediate delivery, and left the one addressed to her mother on the hall table, where the morning post was sorted every day. She walked out the front door into the grey November morning. She did not feel triumphant, She did not particularly feel brave. She felt the way a room feels when the fire goes out, and you understand that if you want it to burn again, you will have to build it yourself, which is not a terrifying feeling once you have sat with it long enough to understand it is simply true. She was back inside the house by midday. Her mother had found the letter. The conversation that followed was the longest and most clearly spoken they had had in 4 years, and Josephine kept her voice level throughout it and did not use the word biddable, though she was aware of it the entire time, like a stone in a shoe that one has chosen to leave in place, because removing it in the present company seems inadvisable. Lady Hartwell said that she was throwing away her future. Josephine said that she preferred to keep it. Her mother said that she would regret this. Josephine, who had been studying the middle distance of the drawing room during the conversation, looked at her mother directly then for the first time in the exchange and said that she expected she would find something rather better to do with the time than regret. The 3 days that followed were very quiet. Josephine answered her mother's correspondence as usual, carrying the ordinary business of the household forward on the assumption that ordinary life was the correct response to extraordinary circumstance. She read the Radcliffe novel she had bought. She walked to the bookshop once and back, and did not encounter anyone of note on the lane. On the morning of the 4th day, Lady Hartwell announced at breakfast that she had invited a small gathering to the drawing room that afternoon, 6 or 7 of the neighbourhood's better families to take tea, and that Sir Reginald had been included in the invitation. She said this without looking at Josephine and with a quality of settled confidence that made it clear the gathering was not, in fact, a tea party. Josephine ate her toast and said nothing, and spent the morning in the upper library with a volume of essays that she did not read a word of. By 2 in the afternoon, the drawing room was arranged for company. Mrs. Fogel had brought in the better tea service and set the small table near the east window and placed chairs enough for 8. The room looked, Josephine thought, as it always looked when her mother intended something irreversible to happen inside it: orderly, well-lit, and faintly ceremonial. The guests arrived in the usual sequence. Mrs. Alderton and her eldest daughter arrived first, as they always did, because Mrs. Alderton considered punctuality a form of social dominance. The Mrs. Palmer arrived next with their mother. The Reverend Holt's wife came with her niece from the next parish, a girl who had been presented the previous spring and was reported to be contracted already. Sir Reginald arrived at 2:30 in the newer carriage, wearing a coat that was slightly too warm for the room, and stood near the mantelpiece in the position Josephine had observed him favour on his previous visit. Josephine sat near the window to one side of the gathering centre and held her teacup and looked at the lane outside and waited. The footman, a young man named Thomas who had been in the household service for 3 years and was reliable in proportion to his general seriousness of expression, appeared in the drawing-room doorway at 10 minutes before 3. He announced Lord Ellsworth Crane of Ashford Park. The room changed in the way rooms change when a name lands inside them with a weight that no one present had anticipated. Lady Hartwell's hands, which had been settled in her lap in the same confident posture Josephine had observed at the morning of Sir Reginald's first visit, went very slightly still. Mrs. Alderton's head turned. The Mrs. Palmer exchanged a look that was too quick to read. Sir Reginald's hand, resting on the mantelpiece, moved approximately 1 inch toward his side before he seemed to notice it moving and returned it to its original position. The man who walked through the Hartwell drawing-room doorway was, without question, the man who had stood in the bookshop doorway in a coat collar, turned up against the October rain, and had said that most people found looking at what was in front of them the hardest part. He was dressed for a formal call. There was nothing about his appearance that required explanation or accommodation. He moved through the room in the way a man moves through a room that he has no need to claim, because the room has already accommodated itself to his arrival, and he acknowledged Lady Hartwell with a formal courtesy, and then turned to address the room in general. Lady Hartwell, who recovered more quickly than the room around her because she had been managing social surprises for 30 years, found her voice and extended the appropriate welcome in the appropriate register. And there was a beat in which everyone present recalibrated, visibly, the understanding of who was standing in whose drawing room. He turned eventually to where Josephine was sitting near the window. He said, "Good afternoon, Miss Hartwell," in the same measured, slightly clipped voice in which he had told her he was glad she had said what she'd said about the verses. And she rose and took his extended greeting, and found she had nothing immediately to say, which was not her usual situation, and which she found, perversely, rather clarifying. He then turned to Lady Hartwell, who was now standing, and whose expression had settled into the surface composure of someone who has not yet decided which direction the territory is moving. He said, with the particular directness Josephine recognized, that he believed he owed Lady Hartwell a somewhat fuller introduction than he had provided to the neighbourhood generally over the previous weeks. He said that he had come to Ashford Park in October with the specific intent of understanding what the neighbourhood was rather than what it presented itself to be, and that he had found it rather more considerable than he had been led to expect, and, in one particular respect, more considerable than he had words to adequately account for. Sir Reginald said from the mantelpiece that it was irregular for a man of his lordship's standing to be moving about the countryside under a partial name, and that he was not entirely sure what the purpose of it had been. Lord Crane looked at Sir Reginald for a moment, in the particular way he looked at things when he was about to say something that did not require ornamentation. He said that the purpose had been to hear what people said when they did not know who was listening. The room absorbed this. He then looked at Lady Hartwell and said that he had asked her daughter a question at the Ashford Assembly Rooms on the 3rd Thursday of October, and that she had answered him as directly and honestly as he had any expectation of being answered, and that he had not forgotten the answer, and that he would not forget it. Lady Hartwell said with some effort at the reasonable register that Josephine was of course a very good girl, and that she had every confidence. Josephine, looking at her mother's face, saw the moment when Lady Hartwell understood what was actually happening in the drawing room she had arranged for an entirely different purpose, and she felt something that was not triumph and was not pity, and was somewhere between the two, a kind of recognition of how long she had lived in this room inside her mother's understanding of who she was, and how different the room now looked. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded square of cream wool with a blue border, and placed it on the side table near where Josephine was standing, with the same matter-of-fact attention he gave to everything, as though the gesture required no explanation at all. She looked at the shawl on the side table. He said that he believed it had been promised to a Mrs. Hewitt, but that Mrs. Hewitt had told him, when he had called at the farm to return it, that it belonged to the young woman from Hartwell House, and ought to go back to her. Josephine looked up at him. The cream wool was slightly damp still at one corner from the October rain, and the blue border was faded in 2 places from a winter of use, and she had made it herself with wool purchased in the market at 1 shilling and 6pence the skein, and it was one of the few things in the house that she could say she had made entirely for herself, and entirely by choice. She said quietly that she was glad it had found its way back. He said that it had been determined on that point from the beginning. Sir Reginald departed the drawing-room within the next quarter-hour, making his farewells with the rigid courtesy of a man who has understood that the ground beneath him has changed, and who is choosing, wisely, to remove himself from the changed ground before the full dimensions of the change become any clearer to the assembled witnesses. Mr. Cray, waiting in the hallway, followed him out. The door closed, and the sound of the carriage on the front gravel drive was audible briefly, and then gone. Lady Hartwell remained in the drawing room for the rest of the call, performing the familiar role with the precision of long practice, pouring tea and addressing her guests in the warm social register she had developed over 30 years of presiding over precisely these kinds of afternoons, and there was no point at which she lost the surface composure altogether, which Josephine recognized as a form of considerable skill, even if she could not admire the application of it. The neighborhood guests drank their tea and understood, collectively, that something had shifted in the social landscape of the parish, and they stored this information away in the particular way that neighbors do, with great care to be distributed later in appropriate settings. After the guests had gone and the drawing room had been quieted by Mrs. Fogle's efficient restoration of the ordinary order of the furniture, Josephine stood at the window and looked at the lane outside. The afternoon light was going in the way it goes in November, without ceremony, simply withdrawing until what remained was a grey and patient dusk. Her mother came and stood beside her, which she did not often do. They stood in the ordinary proximity of the window for a moment without speaking, in the way that two people sometimes stand beside each other when everything that needs to be said has already been said in other rooms at other times, and what remains is simply the fact of standing in the same space. Lady Hartwell said after a moment that she had always believed Josephine would find her way. Josephine said with the evenness she had been refining for 6 years that she was glad to hear it. There was a pause in which neither of them said what they were actually thinking, which was, perhaps, the most honest form of conversation they had managed in years. In the weeks that followed, Lord Crane called at Hartwell House 3 more times in the formal manner, and once informally, walking with Josephine down the lane to the bookshop on a morning that was cold and bright in the particular way November mornings are sometimes cold and bright, as though the season is making a brief and sincere effort before the serious weather arrives. He had answers to 3 questions she had been turning over since the assembly rooms, and she had answers to 2 he had apparently been turning over since the day outside the bookshop. And on the walk back he told her, without particular drama, what the question at the ball had been, in case she had not understood it at the time. She said that she had understood it perfectly. He said that he had thought as much. She said that she had simply answered without thinking first, which had seemed like the appropriate response. He said that it had been the correct response. The lane was quiet and the light was low and the bookshop was behind them, and Hartwell House was ahead, and the world of the parish and the season and the year 1823 was conducting its ordinary business all around them, and Josephine walked beside him with her hands free and the blue-bordered shawl around her shoulders against the November cold, and felt, with a steadiness she had not expected, that she was walking towards the house she had grown up in, as though she were walking toward it for the first time, as though the house itself had been waiting for her to understand what it could be rather than what it had been. She did not know precisely what the next months would bring. She knew certain things with the plain clarity of a woman who has spent 3 years examining the actual contours of her circumstances without the comfort of pretending them other than they were. She knew that her mother would require time. She knew that the neighborhood would distribute its stored information according to its own logic and timeline. She knew that the question asked at the Ashford Assembly Rooms on the 3rd Thursday of October, the one about the verses in the December issue of the Literary Gazette, had never really been about the verses at all, and that she was glad now to understand what it had actually been, though she had answered it correctly the first time without knowing, which seemed to her to be the best possible evidence that the answer had been true. The front door of Hartwell House was ahead. The brass handle was cold in her glove when she reached it. She opened it and stepped across the threshold into the warmth of the hallway, where Mrs. Fogle was crossing with a lamp lit against the early dark, and the house smelled of lavender and beeswax, and the particular November warmth of a fire well laid. and Josephine stood in the hallway of the house she had grown up in and belonged to it completely. In a way she had not belonged to it for years, and found that the belonging felt nothing like what she had expected and everything like what she had needed. And she set her hand on the familiar post at the foot of the stairs, the worn wooden one smoothed by 1,000 mornings of exactly this gesture. And she was home.